Hello, church family. It's Pastor Luke, and I'm back today to answer another one of your big questions. Is suffering bad? You can't experience life as a human being without going through suffering at some point in your life. We're all familiar with it to varying degrees. Some of us have suffered in the past, some of us will suffer in the future, and others of us are just suffering like right smack in the midst of it right now. And it hurts. There's pain, sometimes a lot of it, to the point where it seems like an unfair amount. And naturally, we want it to end, or we try to numb it. Suffering, we conclude, must be a bad thing, something we should seek to avoid at all costs. C.S. Lewis, though, had a different take on it. He said, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks to us in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. Now, it's important to acknowledge, first off, that God is never the source of evil. He is good, holy, and righteous, and anytime suffering occurs, he grieves right alongside of us. God takes no pleasure in seeing his children in pain. And indeed, at the end of all things, when Jesus comes again to establish his permanent kingdom, he says this is going to be a world where there is no more mourning or crying or suffering or pain or tears, for the old order of things has passed away. Suffering and pain, then, will have no place in heaven. So, in that sense, they fall short of God's ideal. And yet, this side of heaven, God always has a way of using even bad things for our good. And he uses suffering to mold and inform and shape us like a piece of metal tempered through a hot forge. In fact, the Apostle Paul, he goes so far as to say this: more than that, we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not put us to shame. Suffering for its own sake isn't necessarily a good thing, right? It's not particularly virtuous to suffer just for suffering's sake. And yet, in suffering, we have the opportunity to rely upon God in a way that we don't when things are good. And when we turn to God in the midst of our sufferings, when we identify in our wounds the wounds of Christ, when we finally despair of our own ability to win at life and trust in Christ's victory instead, when we die to ourselves so that he can raise us to life, when that happens, our trust grows and our relationship with God is strengthened. Suffering then becomes the tool that God uses to forge us into the image of his Son. And if something makes us more like Christ, man, what else can we do but rejoice and give thanks for it? Suffering as a Christian is also a reminder that this world is not our home. Life is not as it should be, and this knowledge creates in us a deep-seated longing for something more, something better. In other words, suffering makes us homesick for heaven, which is the final destination for believers. One day, all suffering will end. One day, there will be no more tears. But until then, we can take heart, because for the Christian, suffering is never wasted.